So the Nikon Z6 II has a 24 megapixel backside illuminated full frame sensor, and the Z6 III has a 24 megapixel partially stacked full frame sensor. So in this video, we're going to take a look at some side-by-side comparisons and see how the two cameras stack up against each other, and we'll see if there's any difference in the image quality. Now I have a bunch of landscape images that we'll look at, as well as some night sky examples. Now these are all RAW files imported with Lightroom's default settings. I haven't made any adjustments to the images, and for all the shots in this video I'm shooting manually, including setting a manual Kelvin value for the white balance. But anyway, let's go ahead and look at the first comparison. So globally the images look identical to me, and for this image I used the 24 to 120 millimeter lens, and everything looks identical as far as the color and contrast. And if we take a look at 100%, we can see that the detail is exactly the same between the two cameras as well. Alright, so let's go ahead and move up the ISO range and see what kind of results we get. So we'll start at ISO 100 and go all the way up to ISO 51200. So for this next shot, I used the 100 to 400 millimeter lens. If you look at the shadowy area here, you'll see that there isn't any noise at all at ISO 100. And if we switch to ISO 200, everything still looks nice and clean. Moving to ISO 400, still super clean, very low noise here. And same thing here at ISO 800. I can see just a very slight bit of noise, but really clean still. ISO 1600 still looks quite good. A little bit more noise, but really not much at all. And if we move to ISO 3200, some more noise is introduced, but the image quality is still very good for both cameras. Here I'm noticing maybe just a slight bit more noise on the Z6 III, but only by a very small amount. They are basically still the same. Now at ISO 6400, essentially identical here. Again, I can see like a tiny bit more noise on the Z6 III, but really not much difference at all. And here's another example at ISO 6400, we get a similar result. And if we look at ISO 12800, they are both getting noisier with roughly the same amount of noise for both cameras. The Z6 II is just a hair cleaner to me, but just barely. And here's another example at 12800. Alright, let's move up to ISO 25600. Now both are very noisy here, not much difference at all. And then ISO 51200 now. There's tons of noise for both images by this point. Don't really see much difference between the two cameras here. Alright, so next I have some ISO 100 images that I underexposed by 3, 4, and 5 stops. I'll go ahead and bring the exposure up by 3 stops for this one. Then I will go ahead and copy that and paste it into these others. And then we will compare. And they are basically the same. I mean, both images still look very good. I can see just a tiny amount more graininess on the Z6 III, but you have to really look for it. And here's another example. Next we'll look at a 4-stop exposure boost. The images still hold together pretty well overall. Again, I can see like a little bit more noise on the Z6 III, but not by much. And here's another example. Alright, next we'll look at a 5-stop exposure boost. And here it looks like a color shift on the Z6 II towards magenta. And looking closer, the additional noise on the Z6 III is definitely a little bit more noticeable to me now. And in this other example, we see the same thing. So next we have some overexposed shots. So I overexpose by 1, 2, and 3 stops. And just gonna bring the exposure down by 1 stop for this one. Then copy and paste that into the other images. And it looks like both cameras handle that pretty well. Don't really see much difference between the two cameras. Same thing with this other shot. So next we'll bring the exposure down by 2 stops. You can see we've lost some details in color, but there's no discernible difference between the two cameras. They are both performing identically here. And we don't see any difference with this other image either. So next we'll do a 3-stop exposure reduction. And now you can see that we've lost a ton of information, but both shots still look identical. There's no difference between them that I can see. And same thing when we look at this other example. Alright, so next we'll look at some night sky images. So here's a 20-second exposure at ISO 3200. If we zoom in and examine the noise, we'll see that both cameras look pretty much the same. Both handle ISO 3200 very well for nightscapes. And these next shots are at ISO 6400, and I'm not seeing any difference here either. They are basically identical. And at 12,800, there still doesn't really seem to be much difference at all. There might be just a hair more noise on the Z6 III, but definitely not by much. And if we look here at ISO 25,600, I can definitely see a bit more noise in the darkest areas here on the Z6 III. And then ISO 51,200, I mean, they're both very noisy, but the Z6 III has more noise, especially noticeable in the black areas here. Alright, so next let's go ahead and stress test these shots a bit. Now obviously you wouldn't want to do this in the real world, but I want to really push these files to the extreme here. So I'm just going to drag the exposure way up, all the way to 5 stops, and we can see what's going on in those dark areas. And I'm just going to paste that adjustment into the other files. And now we can see a ton of noise, of course, but there's definitely more noise in the Z6 III files here at ISO 3200. Looking at ISO 6400 now, the Z6 II is a bit cleaner for sure, though again both are super noisy. Pretty much the same thing here at ISO 12,800. And at ISO 25,600 here, we're seeing almost all noise. And then at ISO 51,200, I mean, wow, I don't even really have words for this. It's pretty noisy. Now let's go ahead and look at all these together. And you can really see the noise and color changes as we move up the ISO range. Alright, so after all these tests, what's my conclusion here? Well, overall, I think that the image quality is mostly the same between the two cameras. I mean, there are some cases at higher ISOs where the Z6 III does have a bit more noise, but the difference is so small that it's basically negligible. Now, if you really push a file and do some extreme adjustments, the difference tends to become more noticeable for sure, but I think in real world usage, there isn't really going to be a significant difference in image quality coming out of these two cameras. So the partially stacked sensor of the Z6 III, in my opinion, it doesn't really give up much at all compared to the BSI sensor on the Z6 II. I mean, both cameras produce great images, and I can definitely recommend either one as far as image quality. They're both really good. Now, obviously the Z6 III has much improved video and autofocus features, as well as some other differences. So I'd say that if you want or need those features, then Z6 III all the way. But if you don't need those features, I mean, the Z6 II is a very capable camera and costs a lot less. So, if you don't need the new stuff on the Z6 III, then the Z6 II is a great choice.